If someone asked you where the Vikings went, what would your answer be? Most people would probably say they disappeared. They imagine the Viking Age ending sometime around the 11th century, the longships vanishing from the horizon, and the great Norse kingdoms fading quietly into history. It feels like a story with a clear beginning and an equally clear ending. But what if that ending never really happened? What if the Vikings never vanished at all? What if the strongest surviving evidence of their existence is not hidden inside a museum, buried beneath an ancient burial mound, or locked away in a forgotten manuscript, but something you have spoken your entire life without giving it a second thought, your surname? At first, that sounds almost impossible. Surely if a family had genuine Viking roots, the name would sound unmistakably Scandinavian. Something dramatic, something ending in son, perhaps even a name still common in Norway or Iceland today. That is exactly what generations of people have believed. And it is precisely why one of history's greatest clues remained hidden in plain sight. Because the most remarkable Viking surnames in Britain often do not sound Viking at all. They sound English, they sound Scottish, some even sound Norman or French. They have become so familiar that nobody thinks to ask where they really came from. Yet beneath those ordinary sounding names lies a story of migration, survival and transformation that stretches back more than 1,000 years. The greatest misunderstanding about the Vikings is that they were only raiders. History books often freeze them in a single dramatic moment, longships cutting through the morning mist, monasteries under attack, and warriors carrying axes onto unfamiliar shores. Those events happened, but they tell only the opening chapter of a much longer story. Because after the raids came something far more important: the settlers stayed. They cleared forests, drained marshland, built farms, established thriving market towns, and married into local communities. Their children grew up speaking both Old Norse and Old English. Their grandchildren no longer saw themselves as foreign settlers at all. Over generations, they became woven into the fabric of Britain itself, leaving behind something far more enduring than swords or ships. They left language, they left place names, they left traditions, and above all, they left surnames. Here is where the mystery deepens. Modern archaeology has uncovered Viking settlements beneath fields that for centuries appeared completely ordinary. Linguists have discovered hundreds of Norse words still hiding inside British place names. Even more remarkably, geneticists studying ancient DNA and modern populations have found evidence that confirms what historians long suspected, but could never fully prove. These three completely different fields of research, archaeology, language, and genetics, are all pointing toward the same astonishing conclusion. The Viking story did not end when the raids stopped. It continued quietly through ordinary families whose descendants still live across Britain today. Take a moment to think about some of the most familiar surnames you've ever heard: Wilson, Harrison, Jackson, Robson. Nothing about them immediately suggests Scandinavia. Most people would never connect them with the Viking world. Yet historians now recognize that the simple ending son became widespread across northern England through Scandinavian naming customs that spread during the Viking settlement of the Danelaw. Those names are not proof that every Wilson or Harrison descends directly from a Viking warrior, but they preserve a naming tradition carried into Britain by Norse settlers and passed from generation to generation until it became so ordinary that its remarkable origin was forgotten. Sometimes history survives not through kings or battles, but through everyday habits that quietly outlive the people who created them. Before we uncover the first remarkable surname in detail, I'd like to ask one small favor. If you enjoy documentaries that uncover the hidden history behind Britain's surnames, forgotten ancestry, and the latest discoveries from archaeology and DNA research, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to UK Bloodlines, and tell us your surname and where your family comes from in the comments below. Every like, every subscription, and every comment is the only way to help this channel continue producing carefully researched documentaries like this, and your support genuinely makes these investigations possible. Now imagine standing on the eastern coast of England on a cold autumn morning sometime during the late 9th century. The sea is calm, broken only by the sound of waves washing gently onto the shore. Fishermen pull in their nets, while smoke rises from timber cottages scattered along the coastline. Children laugh as they run across the sand collecting shells, completely unaware that history is about to change forever. Then one fisherman stops what he is doing. Far beyond the breakers, dark shapes begin to emerge from the mist. At first there is only one, then another, then 10. Before long, dozens of long, narrow ships are gliding silently across the water. The laughter disappears, the village falls silent. Nobody standing on that shoreline could possibly know they are witnessing the arrival of people whose influence will shape Britain's language, its laws, its landscape, and even the surnames spoken more than 1,000 years later. Many of those ships came seeking wealth. Others came seeking land. But unlike the legends, not all of them returned home. Families settled beside rivers, built wooden halls, cultivated fields, and slowly transformed temporary camps into permanent communities. They named streams, valleys, and villages using the words they had brought from Scandinavia. Over time, those villages became towns. Those descriptions became family names. Those family names crossed centuries, crossed oceans, and eventually spread across the English-speaking world. Long after the ships had rotted away and the kingdoms had disappeared, the names survived. Yet even that extraordinary story tells only half the truth. Because centuries later, Britain experienced a second arrival of people whose roots also stretched back to the Viking world. Although almost nobody recognized them as such, they did not speak Old Norse, they spoke French. They wore chainmail beneath colorful banners, instead of carrying round shields painted with dragons. History remembers them simply as the Normans. But the very word Norman means Northman, a reminder that their ancestors had once been Viking settlers. That forgotten connection would produce some of Britain's greatest noble families and create a second wave of Viking heritage hidden within British surnames. By the time we reach the end of this documentary, you may never look at your own family name in quite the same way again, because the greatest Viking artifact still surviving in Britain may not be buried beneath the earth at all. It may have been spoken around your family's table for generations, without anyone ever realizing the incredible story it was quietly preserving. When the first Viking ships appeared along Britain's coastline, fear spread far faster than the news itself. Stories traveled from village to village of monasteries stripped of their treasures, coastal settlements abandoned overnight, and kings struggling to defend territories that had been secure for generations. To the people living through those terrifying years, it must have seemed as though the Vikings had arrived only to destroy. Yet history often judges events differently from those who experience them. Looking back more than 1,000 years later, we can see that something far more significant was unfolding. The greatest legacy of the Vikings was never the raids that filled medieval chronicles. It was the communities they built after the fighting ended. By the middle of the 9th century, Scandinavian settlers had begun establishing permanent homes across large parts of northern and eastern England. They did not simply occupy abandoned land. They farmed it, they traded from it, they raised families upon it. Instead of living in temporary camps, they built villages connected by rivers and fertile farmland. Over time, those settlements grew into thriving communities where Norse customs blended naturally with those of the Anglo-Saxons already living there. Children grew up hearing both Old English and Old Norse spoken in the same marketplaces. Farmers borrowed new techniques from one another. Craftsmen exchanged ideas. Marriages united families who only a generation earlier would have considered each other strangers. This was not the replacement of one people by another. It was the beginning of a new society, one whose influence would quietly shape Britain for centuries. One of the clearest reminders of that transformation still surrounds us today, although most people drive past it without ever noticing. Across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Cumbria, Lancashire, and the East Midlands, hundreds of villages preserve Norse words that have survived almost unchanged for more than 1,000 years. Look carefully at a map, and a remarkable pattern begins to appear. Places ending in by, Thorpe, Thwaite, Toft, Beck, and Cald cluster across the very regions where archaeologists continue uncovering evidence of Viking settlement. These endings are not random. They are the fingerprints of an ancient language that became permanently embedded in Britain's landscape. Imagine a young Norse family arriving in Yorkshire sometime around the year 900. After weeks at sea, they finally find a narrow valley crossed by a clear stream flowing from the hills. It offers fresh water, fertile land, and enough timber to build a home before winter arrives. Together they raise a simple wooden hall, fence the livestock and begin cultivating the surrounding fields. To them, the stream is simply a becker, the Old Norse word for a brook or small river. They use the word every day without imagining that it will survive long after they are gone. Their children grow up beside that same stream. Their grandchildren inherit the farm. Centuries later, descendants who no longer speak a single word of Old Norse become known simply as the family from the Beck. The stream remains. The surname remains. The people who first spoke the word disappear into history. That is the extraordinary power of surnames. They preserve moments that written history often overlooks. Castles collapse, kingdoms rise and fall, languages evolve beyond recognition. Yet a family name can quietly carry the memory of a single farm, a single valley, or a single stream across dozens of generations. Historians sometimes describe surnames as linguistic time capsules because they preserve fragments of everyday life that would otherwise have vanished forever. One of the clearest examples is the surname Thorpe. It comes from the Old Norse word warp, meaning a secondary settlement or an outlying village established beside an older community. Across northern and eastern England, dozens of villages still end in Thorpe, marking places first organized or expanded during the period of Scandinavian settlement. Families who eventually adopted the surname Thorpe were not named after a famous warrior or nobleman. They were named after the place where generations of their ancestors lived. Every time that surname is spoken today, it quietly echoes the language of the Norse settlers who first shaped that landscape. Another remarkable example is Toft, derived from the Old Norse word Toft, referring to a homestead or building plot. It was a practical word used by ordinary farming families, yet it survived the centuries to become both a place name and a surname. Even today, similar words remain part of the Scandinavian languages spoken in Norway and Denmark, reminding us just how enduring these linguistic connections really are. Then there is Kar, a surname that traces back to the Old Norse kjar, describing marshy woodland or brush-covered wetlands. To modern ears it sounds like a simple family name, but to a Viking farmer it described a very specific landscape, the kind of fertile yet challenging ground where settlements often developed. Likewise, Fors comes from the Old Norse word for a waterfall, while Keld derives from Kelda, meaning a natural spring. These are not names invented centuries later. They are everyday words once spoken by Scandinavian settlers as they described the land around them, words that gradually transformed into surnames as medieval Britain began adopting hereditary family names. By now, another fascinating pattern should be emerging. These names are not scattered randomly across Britain. Together they create an invisible map of Viking settlement. Overlay the distribution of surnames such as Beck, Thorpe, Toft, Kar, Fors and Keld with archaeological discoveries, and the similarities become striking. The regions where Viking artifacts, Norse burials and Scandinavian settlements are most commonly found are often the very same regions where these surnames remain concentrated today. It is almost as though the landscape itself has been preserving a memory of the people who once transformed it, but just when historians believed they understood the full extent of Britain's Viking legacy, another discovery forced them to rethink everything. They realized there was a second group of British surnames carrying Norse heritage, not through the settlements of the Danelaw, but through some of the most powerful noble families ever to rule medieval Britain. The remarkable truth was that Viking influence had reached Britain twice, and the second journey was even more surprising than the first. The discovery that Viking settlers reshaped northern and eastern Britain would already be remarkable on its own. Yet just when historians thought they understood the full story, they uncovered something even more extraordinary. The Vikings did not influence Britain once, they influenced it twice. The second time, they did not arrive wearing harness helmets, carrying round shields or speaking Old Norse, they arrived speaking French. They came as knights, nobles and commanders following William the Conqueror across the English Channel to 1066. History remembers them simply as the Normans. But the name Norman itself reveals the secret that many people overlook. It literally means Northman. These were the descendants of Scandinavian Vikings who had settled northern France almost a centuries earlier before gradually adopting the French language, Christianity, and many aspects of Frankish culture. They looked different from the Vikings who had landed in Yorkshire and Northumbria generations before, but their story began in exactly the same place, Scandinavia, Picture the northern coast of France in the early 10th century. The Frankish king faces a problem he can no longer solve through warfare alone. Picture the northern coast of France in the early 10th century. The Frankish king faces a problem he can no longer solve through warfare alone. Viking raids have become relentless, and defending every mile of coastline is impossible. Instead, he makes an extraordinary decision. Rather than continue fighting, he offers land to the Viking leader Rollo in exchange for loyalty and protection. The agreement changes European history forever. Rollo and his followers settle the region that soon becomes known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Over the generations that follow, their descendants marry local families, learn to speak French, build stone castles instead of wooden halls, and become one of medieval Europe's most powerful ruling classes. They no longer think of themselves as Vikings, yet their ancestry remains unmistakably Scandinavian. Nearly 150 years later, another fleet prepares to cross the sea. This time the ships are larger, the army more disciplined, and the objective far greater than a seasonal raid. It is the autumn of 1066. Hundreds of vessels gather along the Norman coast as houses are loaded aboard. Armor is inspected, and banners bearing the symbols of great noble houses flutter in the sea breeze. Among the soldiers are families whose ancestors once sailed from Scandinavia to France generations earlier. They may speak French, but their story began in the Viking world. When William wins the Battle of Hastings, those families are rewarded with vast estates across England, introducing a second wave of Norse heritage into British history without most people ever realizing it. This forgotten chapter explains why some of Britain's oldest aristocratic surnames carry an unexpected Scandinavian connection. Consider the surname Percy. To most people, it represents one of England's greatest medieval noble houses, famous for defending the northern border and shaping centuries of British politics. Yet the family originally took its name from the Norman village of Percy before arriving in England after the conquest. The surname sounds thoroughly Norman, because it is, but the Norman family itself descended from people whose ancestors had once been Viking settlers in northern France. The same remarkable journey can be traced through surnames such as Mowbray, Darcy, Beaumont, Neville and Sinclair, originally St. Clair. Each became deeply woven into British history, yet each belongs to a world that ultimately began with Scandinavian settlements. Imagine being a young page serving one of these Norman lords shortly after the conquest. You grow up inside a newly built stone castle overlooking land your family has only recently received from the king. Around you, French is spoken in the Great Hall, while outside the castle walls, English farmers continue working the fields their ancestors cultivated long before the conquest. Within a generation, those worlds begin to merge. Children grow up speaking multiple languages, customs blend together. Local families adopt Norman traditions, while Norman nobles gradually become part of Britain itself. Once again, history repeats the same pattern. The newcomers do not simply conquer the land. They become part of it. This is why surnames are such extraordinary historical evidence. They preserve journeys that people themselves eventually forgot. A family called Sinclair today may immediately think of Scotland, because that is where the name became famous. A family called Percy may associate their surname entirely with medieval England. Yet behind both lies another forgotten chapter, stretching back through Normandy to Scandinavia itself. Their names quietly preserve a migration spanning 3 different countries and more than 2 centuries of European history. It is important, however, to separate fascinating history from exaggerated claims. Carrying one of these Norman surnames does not automatically prove direct Viking ancestry. Medieval noble families often expanded through marriage, inheritance and alliances, while surnames themselves spread far beyond the original bloodlines that first carried them. History is rarely as simple as saying, "This surname means you are a Viking." That is not how genealogy works. What these names demonstrate is something much more valuable. They show how Viking influence survived by adapting rather than disappearing. Instead of remaining isolated in Scandinavia, it flowed into Normandy, crossed into Britain and gradually became woven into the story of England and Scotland themselves. By now, the picture is becoming far more complex than most people ever imagined. The Viking legacy is preserved in ordinary farming families whose surnames grew from Norse place names. It survives in common patronymic names, ending in son, reflecting naming customs introduced through Scandinavian settlement. It even appears within Britain's medieval aristocracy, through Norman families, whose roots ultimately lead back to Viking settlers in France. 3 different pathways, yet all leading back to the same remarkable source. But one question still remained unanswered. Historians could trace these migrations through documents, castles and surnames, but could they prove that the descendants of these settlers were still living in Britain today? 4 generations. That question remained beyond the reach of history itself. Then modern science entered the investigation, and the answer it uncovered would transform everything we thought we knew about Britain's Viking past. The breakthrough came from a simple question that historians had been asking 4 generations, but could never answer with complete confidence. If Vikings truly settled Britain in such large numbers, where was the biological evidence? Place names could survive even after populations changed. Languages could be adopted by neighboring communities. Surnames could pass from one family to another through marriage, inheritance, or simple coincidence. All of those clues were valuable, but none could prove whether the descendants of those Scandinavian settlers were still living in Britain more than 1,000 years later. For centuries, the answer remained frustratingly out of reach. Then advances in genetics opened a door that historians had never been able to unlock. Imagine a team of researchers gathered inside a modern genetics laboratory. Medieval manuscripts sit beside computers capable of analyzing millions of DNA markers. Archaeological reports are spread across desks, alongside detailed maps showing the boundaries of the old Danelaw. Historians, geneticists, and archaeologists are no longer working separately. For perhaps the first time, they are investigating the same mystery together. Instead of asking what medieval writers believed happened, they are asking what the DNA itself remembers. One of the most influential studies focused on the Wirral Peninsula and neighbouring West Lancashire, regions known from historical records to have received large numbers of Norse settlers expelled from Dublin in the early 10th century. Rather than collecting DNA from random volunteers across Britain, the researchers took an unusually careful approach. They selected men whose paternal grandfathers had lived in the region for generations and whose surnames could be traced in local parish records and tax documents dating back before the year 1600. That detail mattered enormously. It reduced the influence of modern migration and allowed the scientists to look much deeper into the medieval population itself. When the first results appeared, they immediately caught the researchers' attention. Among these long-established local families, they found elevated levels of Y chromosome haplogroup 1A, a paternal lineage significantly more common in Scandinavia than in southern England. On its own, that would already have been an intriguing discovery. But another pattern proved even more revealing. The strongest Scandinavian signal appeared most consistently among families carrying older, locally rooted surnames, rather than among the most widespread British names. It was as though the deepest genetic echoes of Viking settlement had remained hidden within communities that had changed the least over the centuries. Picture a father walking through the same Cumbrian valley his ancestors farmed hundreds of years earlier. His surname has been passed from father to son 4 generations. He knows little about the people who first settled there, only that his family has always belonged to that landscape. Unknown to him, tiny fragments of DNA inherited across countless generations still preserve traces of migrations that took place long before England even existed as a unified kingdom. The surname tells one story, the chromosome tells another. Remarkably, both stories point toward the same distant past. The scientific picture became even clearer in 2020 when researchers refined the evidence further. Rather than examining the broad, 1A lineage alone, they identified specific Scandinavian sublineages found at particularly high frequencies in Norway and Sweden. Those same sublineages appeared disproportionately in regions corresponding closely with the former Danelaw. When scientists compared these results with ancient DNA recovered from Viking Age burials, the similarities became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Independent fields of research were arriving at the same conclusion without relying upon one another. Archaeology revealed Scandinavian settlements. Historical documents described Norse communities. Linguistics preserved their language within place names and surnames. Genetics demonstrated that descendants of those populations were still present in many of the very same regions. Each discipline strengthened the others until the evidence formed one remarkably consistent picture. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of these studies was not what the scientists claimed, but what they refused to claim. Responsible historians and geneticists understand that surnames are not biological passports. A person named Beck, Thorpe, Wilson, Percy or Sinclair cannot be told with certainty that a particular Viking appears somewhere in their family tree. Human history is simply too complex. Families change names, bloodlines merge, children inherit surnames through many different circumstances. Over hundreds of years, the relationship between names and genetics inevitably becomes complicated. The researchers recognized this and resisted the temptation to make sensational claims. Ironically, that scientific caution makes the evidence even more convincing. Instead of promising that every Norse-sounding surname belongs to a Viking descendant, the research demonstrates something far more meaningful. It confirms that Scandinavian settlement left a measurable, lasting impact on Britain's population. The Vikings did not merely pass through, they established communities, raised families, and became part of the genetic history of the British Isles. Their influence survived not because every descendant kept an obviously Scandinavian surname, but because their people gradually blended into the wider population, while quietly preserving pieces of their identity through language, customs, and family names. By now, the mystery that opened this documentary is beginning to answer itself. Britain's Viking legacy is not preserved by one piece of evidence alone. It survives because archaeology, medieval history, linguistics, and genetics all converge upon the same remarkable conclusion from entirely different directions. Individually, each clue is compelling. Together, they become extraordinarily difficult to ignore, yet one final question remains. If surnames cannot guarantee Viking ancestry, what should your own family name mean to you? Is it merely an interesting coincidence? Or is it something far more powerful? The answer lies not in claiming certainty where none exists, but in understanding why the journey behind your surname may be every bit as extraordinary as the people who first carried it. And that is where our story reaches its most important conclusion. The remarkable thing about history is that it rarely disappears. More often, it changes shape. Kingdoms collapse, languages evolve, and borders shift until the world becomes almost unrecognizable, yet small fragments of the past continue traveling quietly through time. A single word survives inside a village name. An old farming custom becomes part of local tradition. A family recipe is passed from one generation to the next. And sometimes, a surname preserves the memory of people who lived so long ago that their own descendants have forgotten where the story began. That is the true legacy of the Vikings in Britain. It is not simply one of conquest, it is one of continuity. Think back to where our journey began. We asked a simple question: where did the Vikings go? After following the evidence from windswept coastlines and forgotten settlements to Norman castles and modern genetics laboratories, the answer has become surprisingly clear. They did not vanish, they settled, they adapted. They married into local communities. They became farmers instead of raiders, merchants instead of explorers, craftsmen instead of conquerors. Over the centuries, they gradually stopped thinking of themselves as Norse at all. They became part of the people who would eventually call themselves English, Scottish and, in many regions, British. Their greatest victory was not won with a sword. It was achieved so quietly that history almost failed to notice it. They survived by becoming indistinguishable from everyone around them. That is why surnames matter. They remind us that history is not only written by kings, generals and chroniclers. Ordinary families shape history too. The man who built his farm beside a small stream in Yorkshire could never have imagined that the word Beck would still be spoken more than 1,000 years later. The settlers who established a small Thorpe, a secondary village on the edge of an older community, never expected that future generations would carry its name across the Atlantic to America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The descendants of Rollo, who accepted land in Normandy and slowly transformed from Viking warriors into French-speaking nobles, could never have known that families such as Percy, Mowbray, Darcy, Neville, Beaumont and Sinclair would become woven into the history of Britain, while quietly preserving the memory of their Scandinavian beginnings. None of them were trying to leave a legacy. They were simply living their lives. Yet history often remembers ordinary people in the most extraordinary ways. Perhaps the most important lesson from this documentary is also the simplest. A surname is not proof. It is a clue. Carrying one of the names we have explored does not automatically make someone the direct descendant of a Viking. Real history is far too complicated for easy answers. Families intermarry. Children inherit names in unexpected ways. Bloodlines spread far beyond the people who first carried a particular surname. The responsible conclusion is not certainty, but curiosity. Your surname may point towards Viking influence, Norse language, or a family rooted in regions shaped by Scandinavian settlement, but it is only one piece of a much larger story. That story becomes richer when combined with parish records, census documents, family trees, local history and, where appropriate, DNA research. Every family follows its own unique path through history. What makes the Viking story so compelling that completely independent fields of research now support one another? Archaeologists uncover Scandinavian settlements beneath fields that appeared ordinary for centuries. Linguists trace old Norse words hidden inside Britain's towns, rivers and surnames. Historians reconstruct migrations from medieval chronicles and legal records. Geneticists identify Scandinavian paternal lineages that remain strongest in the very regions where history says Viking settlers established permanent communities. Each discipline works independently, yet all arrive at remarkably similar conclusions. That is how good history is built. Not from one sensational discovery, but from many different forms of evidence slowly assembling the same picture. There is also something deeply human about this story. It reminds us that identity has never been fixed. Britain was shaped by waves of migration long before the modern age. Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and Normans all contributed something to the society that followed. None completely replaced those who came before. Instead, they left pieces of themselves behind. Languages blended, traditions merged, communities adapted. Every generation inherited something from the last before adding something new of its own. The surnames we carry today are living reminders of that remarkable process. They tell us that history is not a straight line, but a tapestry woven from countless journeys, each one connected to another across centuries. So the next time someone asks your surname, pause for just a moment before answering. Whether your name is Wilson, Harrison, Jackson, Thorpe, Toft, Beck, Carr, Force, Keld, Busby, Garth, Percy, Darcy, Neville, Mowbray, Beaumont, Sinclair, or one of the countless other names shaped by Britain's Viking past, remember that it may carry far more history than you ever imagined. It may preserve the memory of a forgotten village, a family farm, a Norman castle, or a Scandinavian settlement built more than 1,000 years ago. Even if your own ancestry ultimately follows a different path, your surname still connects you to one of the most fascinating chapters in the story of Britain. History has a remarkable habit of surviving in the places we least expect. Not only in museums, ancient manuscripts or archaeological excavations, but in the ordinary words we speak every day. The greatest surviving Viking artifact is not a sword resting behind glass, a weathered longship buried beneath the soil, or a silver hod discovered by chance. It may simply be the family name that has been spoken around your dinner table for generations, quietly carrying the memory of a world that refused to disappear.